On the morning of December 26, 1996, a call to police from a home in Boulder, Colorado would begin one of the most widely discussed criminal investigations in American history. Inside the house lived 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey. Her parents had reported her missing earlier that morning after discovering a handwritten ransom note demanding money for her return. But later that same day, the case took a devastating turn. JonBenét Ramsey was found dead inside the family's home. What followed was a complex investigation that drew national attention, raised difficult questions about evidence and procedure, and left a lasting mark on the community of Boulder. Even decades later, the circumstances surrounding her death continue to be examined and debated. In the mid-1990s, Boulder, Colorado was widely known as a prosperous and relatively quiet university town located at the base of the Rocky Mountains. Home to the University of Colorado Boulder, the city had developed a reputation for its scenic surroundings, strong local economy, and active community life. Neighborhoods were typically considered safe, and many residents viewed Boulder as an ideal place to raise families. The Ramsey family lived in one of the city's residential areas. The household included John Ramsey, his wife Patsy Ramsey, their daughter JonBenét Ramsey, and her older brother Burke Ramsey. JonBenét had gained local attention for participating in children's beauty pageants. Photographs and videos from these competitions would later become widely circulated during media coverage of the case. At the time, however, the pageants were only one part of the family's life in the community. During the holiday season of 1996, Boulder was experiencing the typical quiet atmosphere of late December. Families gathered for celebrations, schools were on winter break, and many residents were spending time at home with relatives and friends. Against this backdrop, the events that unfolded inside the Ramsey home on December 26th would quickly transform a private tragedy into a case followed across the United States. The events of December 26, 1996, began early in the morning inside the Ramsey residence in Boulder, Colorado. According to reports later provided to investigators, Patsy Ramsey woke up and went downstairs, where she discovered a handwritten note on a staircase inside the home. The note stated that her daughter, JonBenét Ramsey, had been kidnapped and demanded a ransom payment for her return. The message reportedly requested $118,000 and instructed the family to wait for further instructions. Shortly after discovering the note, Patsy Ramsey contacted emergency services. Police officers arrived at the home that morning and began an initial response to what was believed to be a kidnapping. During the early hours of the investigation, friends and acquaintances of the Ramsey family also arrived at the house to offer support. As the morning progressed, investigators conducted a preliminary search of the residence while waiting for any potential communication related to the ransom demand. Several hours later, during the early afternoon, John Ramsey searched part of the basement area of the home along with a family friend. Inside a small room in the basement, John Ramsey discovered the body of his daughter. JonBenét Ramsey had been killed inside the house. The discovery immediately changed the direction of the investigation, shifting it from a possible kidnapping to a homicide investigation. The case would soon draw national attention as authorities began trying to determine exactly what had happened inside the Ramsey home. As investigators began examining the scene inside the Ramsey home in Boulder, Colorado, several unusual details quickly became central to the investigation. One of the most widely discussed pieces of evidence was the ransom note discovered earlier that morning by Patsy Ramsey. The message was unusually long for a ransom demand, spanning multiple pages and written on paper believed to have come from inside the Ramsey residence. Investigators also noted that the amount requested in the note, $118,000, closely matched a recent bonus received by John Ramsey from his employer. This detail raised questions about whether the author of the message had specific knowledge of the family's finances. Another unusual aspect of the case involved the location where the body of JonBenét Ramsey was discovered. She was found in a small room in the basement of the family home, several hours after the kidnapping had been reported. Investigators later determined that the crime scene had been significantly disturbed. During the hours between the initial police response and the discovery of the body, several individuals had moved through different areas of the house. As a result, potential evidence may have been unintentionally compromised. Forensic examination also revealed additional elements that investigators attempted to analyze, including physical evidence found on JonBenét's clothing and items located in the basement area. The combination of a ransom note, the location of the body inside the home, and the complexity of the crime scene created a series of questions that investigators would continue examining for years. Once the death of JonBenét Ramsey was confirmed, the case quickly became the primary focus of investigators in Boulder, Colorado. The initial response was handled by the Boulder Police Department. Detectives began collecting physical evidence from the Ramsey residence and interviewing individuals who had been inside the home that morning. From the beginning, investigators faced significant challenges. Because the case had initially been treated as a possible kidnapping, the house had not been immediately secured as a homicide scene. Friends of the Ramsey family had entered the home during the morning hours, and several areas were moved through before the body was discovered. As a result, some investigators later stated that potential evidence may have been disturbed before forensic documentation could take place. Authorities conducted extensive interviews with members of the Ramsey family, including John Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, and their son Burke Ramsey. Forensic specialists also examined the ransom note found inside the home. Handwriting experts reviewed the document in an attempt to determine whether it could be connected to any known individuals. While some analysts believed similarities existed between the note and Patsy Ramsey's handwriting, others concluded that the results were inconclusive. In addition to handwriting analysis, investigators collected physical evidence from the scene, including fibers, fingerprints, and other trace materials. Some DNA evidence was later identified on JonBenét's clothing, although interpreting its significance proved complex. In 1999, a grand jury in Boulder County, Colorado, reviewed evidence in the case. The jury ultimately voted to issue indictments related to child endangerment against John and Patsy Ramsey. However, the district attorney at the time declined to file charges, stating that the available evidence was insufficient to secure a conviction. The investigation continued for years, involving multiple reviews of the case file, forensic re-examinations, and renewed public interest. The death of JonBenét Ramsey quickly transformed from a local tragedy into a national story. For residents of Boulder, Colorado, the case brought an unexpected level of attention to a community that was more often associated with education, outdoor recreation, and a relatively quiet lifestyle. Local media initially reported on the case as a shocking crime within the city. Within days, however, national television networks and newspapers began covering the investigation extensively. Reporters traveled to Boulder to document developments, interview officials, and analyze new information as it emerged. The intense media coverage had a noticeable effect on the community. Residents found their city repeatedly mentioned in connection with a high-profile and deeply unsettling case. Neighborhoods that had previously been viewed as peaceful became the focus of public scrutiny. At the same time, discussions about the case extended beyond Boulder itself. The circumstances surrounding the death of a 6-year-old child, combined with the unusual elements of the investigation, prompted widespread public debate across the United States. The Ramsey family also became the focus of intense public attention. News outlets frequently examined their background, lifestyle, and public statements, sometimes leading to conflicting interpretations of the evidence and the investigation. For many people in Boulder, the case created a lasting memory of how quickly a private tragedy could grow into a national story. Even years later, the name of the city continued to be associated with one of the most widely discussed unsolved cases in American criminal history. Over the years, investigators and prosecutors examined several possible explanations for the death of JonBenét Ramsey. These theories were discussed within official investigations, but none produced a definitive resolution. One line of investigation focused on the possibility that someone inside the home may have been involved. Because the ransom note was written on paper from inside the Ramsey residence and the body was later found in the basement, investigators examined whether the crime could have occurred within the household. This possibility was explored through interviews, handwriting analysis, and other forms of forensic testing involving John Ramsey and Patsy Ramsey. Another theory considered the possibility of an intruder entering the house during the night. Investigators examined potential entry points and analyzed physical evidence found at the scene, including unidentified DNA recovered from clothing belonging to JonBenét Ramsey. Some officials suggested that the DNA evidence could indicate the presence of an unknown individual. Because the evidence contained elements that appeared to support different interpretations, the investigation continued to examine both possibilities. Detectives and prosecutors reviewed forensic results, timelines, and witness statements in an effort to determine which scenario was most consistent with the available facts. Over time, the case file grew to include thousands of documents, forensic reports, and investigative records. Despite these efforts, the available evidence did not lead to charges being filed against a specific suspect. Today, the death of JonBenét Ramsey remains officially unsolved. The investigation has continued in various forms since 1996. Authorities in Boulder, Colorado have periodically reviewed the case file, including re-examining forensic evidence as new technology becomes available. In 2008, the Boulder County District Attorney's Office publicly announced that DNA evidence recovered from JonBenét's clothing did not match members of the Ramsey family. At that time, officials stated that the results supported the possibility that an unknown individual may have been involved. However, investigators have also emphasized that interpreting the significance of trace DNA can be complex. The presence of DNA alone does not necessarily establish how or when it was deposited. Over the years, the case has been reviewed by multiple investigative teams, including forensic specialists and cold case analysts. Despite these efforts, no individual has been formally charged with the crime. The case continues to be considered an open investigation, with authorities indicating that new evidence could still emerge through advances in forensic science. Nearly 3 decades after the events of December 26, 1996, the death of JonBenét Ramsey remains one of the most widely known unresolved criminal cases in the United States. What began as a report of a possible kidnapping inside a home in Boulder, Colorado, quickly evolved into a complex homicide investigation that captured national attention. The unusual elements of the case, including the ransom note, the location of the body within the house, and the challenges investigators faced during the initial response, created questions that continue to be discussed by investigators, journalists, and members of the public. Over the years, new forensic techniques and investigative reviews have attempted to clarify the evidence. Yet the central question remains unresolved. Who was responsible for JonBenét Ramsey's death? For the Boulder community, the case represents a moment when a single event transformed the city's place in the national conversation. For investigators, it remains an example of how difficult it can be to reach certainty in complex criminal cases. And for many observers, the hope remains that future developments in forensic science may eventually provide answers to a mystery that has endured for decades.